Okay, I guess you got the invitation for.
Perfect.
So welcome everybody to this hot off a press presentation of a book co-edited by Felicitas Hillmann and Michael Summers. The book is titled Cities, Migration and Governance, Beyond Scales and Labyrinths, published by Routledge. It's a real pleasure to have the editors presenting the book and two colleagues, Tiziana Caponio from the University of Turin and Hilary from Georgetown or Washington University. I don't remember.
Brown University.
Well, also Brown University, but all over the place. So anyway, but usually in Washington now, Emerita in Brown. And as in previous events, I will shortly present the panel before leaving you the floor. So Felicitas Hillmann is a Berlin-based geographer who has been working on migration since more than 30 years, as far as I can recall. In particular, migration and its relationship with cities. She holds a PhD in geography from Freiburg with Thomas Krings and Hartmut Heusemann, which is one of the connecting elements with me. I also had Hartmut Heusemann as a supervisor, at least as a co-supervisor. And she had several appointments in various research centers from the WZB to the ERS and universities, lastly at the TU in Berlin. She coordinated also many research projects on migration and most recently in the same university, the project on the paradigm change in a migration society. I'm not sure that the English translation is the correct one. On the very same topic, she published extensively, books, papers, journal articles, and everything. And beyond the book she is presenting today, she published very recently also one other book on migration, titled International Migration Research with a Focus on New Technologies and Multiple Crises, which came out also very recently, I would say. We have also the other co-editor of the book, Michael Summers. He's also a geographer based at Kentucky University in the United States. He got his PhD, however, in Oxford with David Harvey and Eric Swigedor. And he's also a long-time scholar of migration studies. And besides the book we are presenting today, he also edited very recently, actually, together with Jens Wittgren, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, the Handbook of Migration and Nationalism from Edward Elgar. He held visiting positions in Sciences Po, in Lille, at the University of Amsterdam, Oxford, Chicago, Nottingham, etc. So thanks, both of you, for presenting your work today. We have also two discussants, as usual. The first one is Tiziana Caponio. She's a political scientist, so not a geographer, from the University of Turin in Italy, and also a research fellow in FIERI. FIERI is the Forum of International and European Research on Migration. She had a Marie Curie Fellowship at the UI in Florence or in Fiesole. And let me, just one second, I have to admit one person, okay? And among her publications, there is one published just a few years ago on a very similar topic about the book presentation today. It's Making Sense of a Multi-Level Governance of Migration, City Networks Facing Global Mobility Challenges, published with Palgrave. I think it's very nice that you are able to be here today and so you can bring in this kind of expertise. Last but not least, Hilary Silver, a professor of sociology, George Washington University and Professor Emerita at Brown University. Also in urban studies there, where she also headed the Center for Urban Studies for quite some time. She was also editor of City and Community, which is the Journal of the Community and Urban Sociology section of the American Sociological Association, which honored her with the Lind Award for Career Lifetime Achievement. She's currently an RC21 board member, and we will hold the yearly conference in Santiago in just a few months from now. So we will meet there, and it will be a pleasure. So I thank you all for being with us today, and give the floor to, I don't know who starts, but I guess Felicitas, so you can share your screen and start the presentation of a book. Thanks a lot to everybody.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Yuri. I mean, we shared for our PhD the same funding institutions, so we know each other for quite some time within social sciences. And I'm now at the Institute of Urban and Regional Planning. So in a way, I left geography a bit. Anyway, thank you for inviting the two of us to this excellent book launch series with Urban Futures. We are very delighted. And we appreciate that very much. Thank you for organizing. Thank you for doing this technically, Breeze, so your team. And we want to thank, before I start the PowerPoint, Tiziana Caponio and Hilary that they come up as commentators today. So we really love to see this transatlantic combination approach here. And I will now start our presentation. And I'm no longer sure which one is the right one. Excuse me one moment.
It's the green one in the bottom.
No, that I know, but I have two. Okay, I'm sorry. This one. Okay, so yes, here we go.
Perfect.
Yeah. So here we go. So thank you for having us. And I directly start with our book. What do we speak about? This is the book we are speaking about. It's published with Routledge. And to be honest, it's the outcome of a special issue on cities and migration we did a while ago with the Geographical Review. And this came up in 2021. But we fully reworked our introduction. We thought it's worth it. And we will speak about the introduction in a moment here. So what is the big picture? What are the aims, the research questions of cities, migration and governance beyond scales and levels? Why that title? Why does the world need our book? So we have two big questions at stake at the moment. And the first one is, how does urban transformation, governance and planning shape the lives of migrants? And how do the lives of migrants shape cities, both formally and informally in Europe and North America? So here you have the transatlantic comparison, which is important for us. And it's about the lives of migrants and the way they shape cities. Second, in the 2020s, we question, why is it that cities are viewed as a solution to the global dynamics of migration and less the nation state? Put differently, why has the narrative of the urban, of the local, become so powerful? And we may ask, for whom? For whom is it powerful? So back to our framing, we see three dominant perspectives on cities and migration in Europe and North America at the moment. And the first one is one which sees the city as a purely territorial and administrative unit, an entity, a statistical unit, something concrete. And this notion of the city you find very often in data-driven research, which is near to the policy discourse and policy-oriented research. So it's rather concrete and statistical. You have another notion which sees the urban as an abstract, as an understanding of structures, institutions, networks, and nodes. And that is more academic, maybe more abstract, and belongs more to critical sciences. And we have a third strand of research, a dominant perspective, which sees diversity as a main focus, a characteristic of the urban, which is produced by migration and migrants. And this is typical for the neoliberalizing and selling the city research. So it's about marketing approaches. It's about the neoliberal city seeing migration and ethnicity as something to be commodified. More on that in a moment. So we must be aware that we see a little sort of confusion between the concrete, so the city and the migrant, the persons and the place as a statistical unit, for example, and the abstract, which is the urban, the notion of the urban, and migration also as an abstract process. That is important to know. And we have, what is our argument? We have 5 arguments, and I hand over to Michael now. So this is the outline. Michael.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to thank everyone. And it's always strange doing a joint presentation when my co-presenter is 7,000 kilometers away. But I want to start off with some introductory comments to what we think are 5 arguments to make about urban governance and migration. So the literature on urban governance and migration, at least in the 21st century, often depicts cities as pro or anti-immigrant, accommodative or restrictive, and inclusive or exclusive. So in order to kind of respond to this, we need a definition or an understanding of governance. And this is how we define it. The territorially and socially complex production, regulation, control, provision, and care of migrant lives in what are conventionally considered to be cities and their wider metropolitan areas. And importantly, we like the term migrant lives rather than the teleological notion of integration. So we use the term migrant lives. And I'm going to talk more about how we conceptualize this in a moment. So our understanding is not about exclusively seeing like a state. So it includes how migrants shape cities and their governance through civil societies, NGOs, official political fora, social movements, and so-called under-the-radar activities. So we are as much concerned with seeing like a society, a kind of sociological approach, or even anthropological approach to governance. So it's as much seeing like a migrant and seeing like a society as it is seeing like a state. Okay, next slide, Felicitas, thanks. So these are the 5 arguments, and the first one is very general. We see a shift from a process of settling newcomers into cities and providing policies to avoid tensions or social disruptions. So the kind of managing and organizing migration and migrants and diversity during the 20th century to a much more comprehensive approach. Next slide, Felicitas. Thanks. So empirically, we see a much more complex form of migration than in the 20th century. So which includes a greater movement of asylum seekers and refugees. This is well known. So we're not saying anything particularly novel here, but this is part of our 5 arguments. And it stems from repeated crises, whether in Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, and Ukraine, to just cite a few examples. And so we argue that this has prompted local civil society actors to take on new responsibilities in light of these repeated crises. We also think there are new private actors from migration industries that help to transform, enhance, renew, or devalue specific urban spaces. So again, Saltonstein pointed out in the early 1990s that migration should be considered as a business. Now it might be considered big business. We continue to stress that migrants are pivotal actors in shaping urban governance. Again, this is not new, but we acknowledge the range of daily grievances, religious demands, community mobilizations, and highly visible protests and contentious politics that have impelled or forced the hand of urban governments to respond in one way or another. Sometimes this is with repression, but it's also with accommodation. So thank you. So this fifth argument is really conceptual. It's not empirically about what's happening, but this is how we conceptualize urban governance. So first is Felicitas's idea of power over and power to. So power over is about oppression, repression. It's about management. It's about enabling certain kinds of pro-migrant policies or politics. So, this can be considered as often a form of hegemony. And then, in contrast, there's the power to. This works in both ways. It works by migrants, but also from extra-urban or extra national institutions and policies. So this could be international institutions and soft power, as much as it could be from social movements. And I'm drawing on my own, shamelessly, I'm drawing on my own concept, socio-territoriality, which I'll explain more about in a moment. And even with the supposed end of globalization or end of neoliberalization, we still think that globalization remains an important concept. And so we want to not only introduce power over, power to, and socio-territoriality, but also the idea of multi-territorial governance. I'll explain more about this. So we're going to start in reverse. We're going to start with these conceptual arguments, this fifth conceptual argument. In urban political geography, scale is a widely used concept. And in political science, multi-level governance, which Tiziana has made an enormous contribution to thinking about. And concerning the first, scale, we argue, and we're going out on a limb here, that scale is both vague and confused, encompassing the incongruous meaning of both territory and the spatial extent of a process, for example. So scale is used in many different ways, and we think that leads to more confusion than light. So concerning multi-level governance, we're not against the basic idea by any means, and we are aware that multi-level governance proponents like Tiziana are aware also of the limitations of this concept. But as geographers and to people who think interdisciplinary ways, in both sociological ways, anthropological ways, as well as political ways, we are wary of a state-centric approach. We're wary of the static, rigid power hierarchies, or nesting, as it's called in the scale literature, that might be implied by levels or even scales. So in the multi-level governance approach, the emphasis on policy outputs over the culturally economic or social inputs associated with these levels of governance. So there's a risk of the underestimation of transnational and translocal connections. So we have in mind here, for example, the significant rise of remittances and the power of digital platforms that act upon these different levels of governance. So what we prefer, again, and we're being very bold here, is the term multi-territorial governance instead of multi-level governance. And the reason for that is multi-territorial governance not only encompasses the ways in which these levels govern migrants, so this is the spatialized power over, but they are shaped by both the intra-urban and extra-urban or transnational, translocal social relations and processes. We refer to these conventionally as inputs into the political process of the territories that these levels govern. So this is the spatialized power too. For us, localization, it kind of straddles both the power to and the power over, and involves a kind of shifting spatial pattern. Okay, thanks. So at the heart of multi-territorial governance is what I call socio-territoriality. And this is really a kind of simple term in my view. It means that cities are territories or jurisdictions, but ones that are also shaped by social networks. Whatever we want to call this kind of politics, grassroots, contentious, social movements, and policies from within and outside cities. But it's recursive, so urban governance in turn shape these networks, politics, and policies. And I said this is not really a new or earth-shattering concept. It draws upon McCann and Ward's concept of territoriality and relationality. So for us, multi-territorial governance is not simply hierarchical, it's also heterarchical in the spirit of kind of Foucault's ideas about power. But it's always within a system of relative state sovereignty. Okay.
So I take over here. Thank you, Michael. Let's return to the first 4 arguments. We see 3 identifiable historical phases of urban governance and migration. I want to come back to that. We spoke about it in the beginning of our talk, in the beginning of the introduction. So if we see a first phase of city governments managing and organizing migration and migrants, that is, for example, true for the period of industrialization when many migrants come into cities because there's socioeconomic restructuring. And we see the building of a new migration infrastructure, which is a classic when for urbanization. We then see policies in the aftermath of diseases and poverty as a consequence of migration into the city in certain neighborhoods. So we see support systems of the welfare state coming up in certain neighborhoods for the benefit of the whole of the city. So cities are places of social policy, or become places of social policies and social infrastructures. And that we mean by managing and organizing. And I would say it's a logic of sorting the environment and migrants within the city. We then have a next phase, which starts about in the 1980s with globalization. So here migration becomes a policy field on its own that is new. So we see the rising of global cities. We have new urban hierarchies worldwide. So new circuits of capital, labor, and migration also. We see that on the global scale, and cities have to fit into that new hierarchy. At the same time, on the spot in the cities themselves, we see the commodification of the ethnic districts for tourists, for example. You have all these little Italies which have become marketized. That is going on in the city. So in a way, we see the starting point for the selling of the city, We have neoliberal policies which turn away from social policies. So the city is often seen as an enterprise. And this is very important when it comes to migration, because the city is in need of highly skilled now, of certain types of migration, and they try to attract them through by the way of their diversity. So they need a certain degree of diversity. At the same time, they need to govern migration, which is not as easy to integrate, I would say. But the idea of the city as an enterprise and the selling point here is important, or gets important. So what we see is now a next phase, I would say, or we would claim, where we have mixed supranational norms and national and subnational policies. We have, on the other hand, the grassroots and contentious politics, social movements, and we find ourselves here in a sort of black box. We do not know precisely how do they speak to each other. And this takes place since about 10 years. Why? And I think here's a part of the answer. If we look on the third phase, so supranational norms and soft policies, it's only 10 years ago that the Sustainable Development Goals, so the SDGs, came up with migration as one factor for development or within development. The Millennium Goals before didn't mention migration at all. So it's now that the two silo discussions on migration, as migration research and studies, come together and speak to each other because they need each other. So the SDGs are in need of the local scale to implement the SDGs. They need some form of transferring their policies, and they have to integrate migration into the picture. Still, the whole thing of the visa policies is still with the state. So the only point of entrance here is the local scale in that case. I want to show you this one. How does it work in this third phase of governance? If you look on the mixed supranational norms and national and subnational policies, we see on one hand the implementation of the SDGs. The hope is to see the city as the place for implementation. On the other hand, we see the cities themselves organizing. So via networks, they have to gain power to use global topics such as migration and climate change for their negotiations to get stronger within this global hierarchies. So we listen to speaking about best practices, bilateral exchange, about implementing local policies. We have many NGOs stepping up now and having a seat on the table. And we hear a certain narrative, which is the one of sustainability and resilience. The picture changes a bit if we look on the grassroots level here, so contentious politics and social movements. Then we hear about diversity as an enrichment. We see narratives such as on democracy and human rights. It's about welcome cultures. It's about sanctuary cities. It's also about best practices. It's about NGOs stepping up. And most important, we have cities where more migrants live. So we have a high percentage of migrants in the United States, but also in Germany. We have in Berlin, for example, neighborhoods with over 50% of inhabitants which have a migration history, to avoid the term migration background here. So this third phase, this black box, has to unify all the different factors and trends, the implementation of the SDGs, transnational city networks. The diaspora formations, for example, is something relatively new. We have the grassroots initiatives, the protest. We have this diversity, which is seen often in an economic perspective as an enrichment. And this is why we think we should we should think beyond scales and levels, new alliances and shared experiences. And I hand over again to Michael.
Okay, so this third phase, we think involves certain challenges and strategies. The first one is about fostering economic development, job creation, and immigrant entrepreneurship in the context of rapidly changing labor market demands. There is also the issue in particularly demographically slower growing cities, post-industrial or deindustrialized cities. There's the issue of filling up empty dwellings and regenerating neighborhoods. So this is especially the case in demographically declining cities. In the second kind of challenge or strategy we see is that in conjunction with business leaders, urban governments want to recruit migrants with a variety of skills, not just highly skilled individuals, not just computer engineers and so forth, but international students as well, to less prosperous and often smaller cities. Urban governments desire or need to some extent to negotiate against central state regulations. So sanctuary cities might be an example of this, or welcoming cities, to become more independent in regulating who may settle in their respective cities, or to fight against, as I hinted at a moment ago, against deportation or in the incarceration of undocumented or illegalized immigrants. And then there's governing the complex entanglements of settling migrants with different statuses. So asylum seekers, refugees, undocumented immigrants, differently skilled migrants, and international students, at the same time recognizing that they themselves are governed by national visa policies. Okay, thanks, Felicitas. There is pressure on cities to settle their fair share or more of asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants. Pressure from transnational or trans-territorial, so interurban or trans-localized networks and social movements of migrants in cities on urban governance. So they feel this pressure. Then there's regulating the thorny boundary between free speech and hate speech, as well as stemming more physical forms of racist violence. There are, exceptions to these strategies and challenges. Pro-migrant cities, that does not necessarily mean that migrants will be elected to public office. So this is highly unusual, for example, in the city of Toronto. Nor does it necessarily mean that recruitment policies will be successful. So one of the chapters in our book about Atlantic Canada sees a lot of problems with recruiting migrants to less demographically dynamic regions of the world. So we see this dichotomy of pro-migrant, anti-migrant cities more as a spectrum than a binary. So let's just summarize our arguments if we can. Our 5 arguments rested on the concept of multi-territorial governance, socio-territoriality, power over power to, and globalization. And so in very brief terms, these concepts view cities as territories or jurisdictions with urban governments that both shape and are shaped by citizen as well as pro-migrant and anti-migrant publics, migration and transnational migrant lives, including these variety of politics, however you want to define them, interurban social and policy networks, national laws and regulation, supranational institutions and soft law, which are all soft laws often based on the value put on human dignity. Intra and extra urban economic networks and flows. If we want to think of localization in those ways, fine. And so we see urban governance as fitting within a spectrum. But again, in this third phase, it varies very much between cities. And this third phase also encompasses processes and elements of the previous phases of urban governance. Okay. Felicitas?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
I mean, we thought you must read yourself through the wonderful 7 chapters we have. But we want to give you a little insight on what the authors wrote in the book. So we have first for Europe, Maurizio Ambrosini. He's speaking about the Italian case on the governance of asylum. And here he speaks on he speaks of the battlefield, he says, on the local level, policies of exclusion and support. So how protest is working for migrant inclusion or even not inclusion and the negotiation about migration. We then have a chapter by Aisha Chagla and Nina Glick-Schiller, Relational Multiscalar Analysis. And the two authors compare 3 cities, which are Manchester, Halle, and Mardin. And they come up with a relational analysis, so a whole theoretical framework on the relevance of reevaluation and intensified political struggle. And it's worth reading this more theoretical piece, I think, very relational, very nice. We then have Birgit Glorious. She speaks about diversity development in post-socialist cities. And she looks on how a locked country as the GDR was, how it developed into an integration governance framework. So her interest, she's pointing to the spatial order of diversity. Also, that is highly stimulating, and I highly recommend to read that yourself. And then we have a contribution by Ilse van Lint and Richard Staring. They are in the Netherlands. And they point to a dimension which is often overseen, which is the emotional cost of social development and of integration. So they focus on the social life of migrants, of refugees, and and how they move or use the space to become an inhabitant, a citizen in the Netherlands. So that is all highly stimulating. And I hand over to Michael for the North American authors' contributions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Felicitas. One of the important things I want to point out here is that many of the contributions use the term or concept of scale, which we didn't necessarily agree with. We prefer this territorial approach, but we still think these are great contributions, even if we conceptualize urban governance in different ways. And these 3 chapters on North America are fantastic empirical contributions, which offer commentaries on theoretical arguments in migration studies. So in the first one, this is a study of Chicago in the aftermath of the Trump election in 2016. And Ruth and Raina point out that even in so-called sanctuary cities such as Chicago, immigrants are vulnerable to deportation. So their chapter discusses a community campaign to identify and stop a mechanism by which immigrants in Chicago were detained and deported. So the community campaign took advantage of the tensions between local police and federal immigration authorities to expose the effects of data sharing on Black and Latinx communities. And in doing so, these community organizations sought a stronger sanctuary policy. So they used, if you will, the tensions between local police and federal immigration authorities to expose this kind of data sharing. In the second one, I'm going to leave you in suspense a little bit. In their study of Los Angeles, Walter, David, and Flores ask why the immigrants' rights movement remained so locally focused for so long in Los Angeles, even when repressive federal enforcement increased in the United States in the 1990s. So their chapter then asks why this particular organization called CHIRLA shifted to the national scale when they did. So their whole chapter is to ask why all of a sudden this particular organization shifted to the national scale in terms of organization. And you have to read the chapter in order to find out why. In the final chapter by Yolanda and Nelson, they begin their discussion by saying, look, there's a lot of work on dynamic global city regions attracting immigrants. But in their study, they want to examine the geographies of immigrant receptivity in smaller city towns in demographically declining regions such as Atlantic Canada. So that includes Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. And they developed the notion of an aspiring gateway and underscore or emphasize the significance of non-state actors and ambiguous, mixed, instrumental and non-instrumental public discourses in seeking to attract immigrants. So thank you very much.
Thanks to you. Thanks everybody for this clear presentation of this interesting book. So I would leave the floor immediately to Tiziana, who has an appointment afterwards. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yuri, and thank you, Michael and Felicitas, for this presentation of a book that I think invites us really to, I mean, as a political scientist, probably, I'm very much focused on integration policies, and this is, the old discourse on multi-level governance already takes us a bit, into the relations and so forth, but geographers are indeed much better, inviting a reflection on the multiple relations that really make the reality of migration in cities and in urban governance more generally. So, I really agree. I have no problem with your critique, and as you said, we have also I have also with my colleagues been writing about the limits of multi-level governance, the limitations of this concept, which is a concept that really focuses on the levels and on the institutions. It is also very much reflecting the European context, I see. While in the US, also in my research, it became really evident for me that, of course, there are institutions at different levels, but this is not the point in this context when we look at policy-making processes. Especially from a local perspective, we see that the alliances that you want to bring to the fore in this book are really at the fore. For instance, Welcome in America, you were mentioning this movement in your book and in some of the articles. So clearly, this is not a level. This is a community of actors that are that have a different background. They can be municipalities, municipal actors, but also NGOs, social movements, so forth, that get together and really form an alliance. In Europe, we are not so familiar with this kind of phenomenon. We see Eurocities is the municipalities there, is a level. And so, you know, as political scientists, of course, we are very much influenced by all the institutions and that in different contexts are the key actors for us in producing a specific type of policies, in my case, migration policies. So I really like the idea of multi-territorial governance. I think it really brings us to reflect a step forward on all the actors and all the factors that interact in cities, which become the real hub where we see all these forces and actors and ideas, narratives, and so forth really interacting in a place. I think that this broad perspective, though, probably needs, and this is the point on which I want to challenge you a bit, needs, though, to be a bit more elaborated from a theoretical point of view. It is a broad perspective, multi-territorial governance. And with your article, with your chapters in this book that were previously articles, you bring these multiple actors into light. But maybe, you know, to step forward, maybe next step would be also for us as scholars to try to understand how different combinations of factors and actors can somehow interact in specific contexts at a local level in specific cities and bring different scenarios into play. You mentioned there are proactive cities, of course, broadly speaking. You said it's not that we have clearly proactive cities, but some cities seem to lean in that direction, and other cities that are rather more reactive. So, you know, my question would be maybe or as a future agenda, really to reflect on in this multi-level, multi-territorial, sorry, it's a political scientist mindset, it's terrible. Multi-territorial governance framework can help us really to understand which configurations can bring about different types of scenarios, more proactive or rather reactive. And I think that there's a point that probably emerges in your discussion in the introduction, and on which maybe scholars should focus more, migration scholars, that is that of the so-called public. You mentioned that many times in the introduction, and I think also in some of the articles, certainly that on Italy, but also on the US cases and the Canadian cases. So there is a public out there that seems to be kind of a noise in the background, and the other actors that try to deal with this public that you don't understand if it's is more open or reactive or oriented. So probably as scholars, we really need to understand how the public out there is somehow implied or interacts with these different actors and institutions that are part of the multi-territorial governance, and also, you know, the factors and so forth. So I leave it there, you know, how to really go in depth in the local public, because we have a lot of surveys, you know, national surveys, representative surveys that tell us something interesting, inconclusive in many cases, because we see that sometimes the public is fine with migration and sometimes it is not. maybe it's time really to understand more the public in action in specific situation and in relation with this multi-territorial governance. I can understand, this is a big issue. I do not expect that you have a solution to that, but maybe this is a point to reflect as a next step in this research on cities. And I leave it there for the discussion. Thanks a lot for having me today.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks a lot, Tiziana. I don't know if you want to have an immediate reaction to Tiziana, because
maybe, yeah.
Maybe a little bit. We speak
Thanks
of the black box on purpose because we think it's really hard to understand and it depends on the context. That is what you're saying. And we need such analysis much more. That's what we want to express with that black box term. We don't know precisely how that is working in which circumstances. So thank you for your comment. Very helpful. I took many notes, and I think Michael also, I saw him.
I was taking a lot of notes, and I also want to acknowledge that it's easy for us as geographers to critique multi-level governance, because we take this broad approach. I mean, the worst kind of criticism is to be ignored, and multi-level governance has not been ignored, and we admire your research because it is focused on institutions, political institutions, and these various levels, and we think that is important. So in some ways, multi-level governance is an easy target if you're not a political scientist. So
and we quote your work.
Yeah.
No, thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
I fully understand.
So,
I mean, and really, I agree. We need to go, beyond that. I absolutely agree that, this mindset of level is a problem, especially also at the policy level. And I stop there. But, in Europe, that you meet always the same actors representing the municipalities, but what is beyond the municipality, this is an issue. I think, it is a good critique, and I take it absolutely as, an invitation to go a step forward.
Yeah, I would also add that, we have to understand in more detail the interaction between pro-migrant and anti-migrant publics and particular urban governance. I mean, and also the dynamics of mayors and other actors within the cities. So there's a lot of work on this, as you know. But I think, the different actors within the government, never mind the public, but, and the interaction between complex pro-migrant and anti-migrant publics and particular individuals and institutions within certain urban governance. So yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful, thanks. I think it was an important point, and I have also a few questions on that, but I would like to leave the floor first to Hilary, and then I might add something at the second stage in the discussion. Hilary, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me, and congratulations on this book. I thought I was supposed to comment on the 3 North American chapters of the book, where Tiziana was going to talk about the European ones, but I guess it's good that I have some general comments to make first. So the collection and the introductory overview make it clear that the common thread among the chapters is is the governance of migration, and they're very clear that it's migrant agency that they're introducing into the study or the discussion of governance, which is different from governments like municipalities, which we've just discussed. So that's a key innovation here. And like Stephen Lukes' 3 Faces of Power, Hillmann's distinction between power over and power to highlights the fact that migrants are both vulnerable and resistant. But if migrant lives and migrant action is part of governance and governing the adaptation, if you will, the settlement of migrants, a few considerations might be fruitfully taken into account. And I just tick off a few of them. I mean, the first thing is, how many migrants live in the city? I mean, there's a question of critical mass, because social movements can sustain their role in governance rather than just short-term mobilizations or one-off protests, only if they're organized and they have sufficient resources to pay what becomes a staff. And this comes out in some of Walter Nichols' chapter. Second, like, who are the migrants? Where are they coming from? So migrant self-help organizations are usually formed along national or linguistic lines. In the Los Angeles case, there wasn't so much a pro-migrant thing as it was labor movements, about labor issues, you know. So, but common values and language can build solidarity, and the traditional norms help create enforceable trust among these groups. But some groups, like especially refugees, they continue to organize politically, but around homeland politics. They're not oriented to local affairs in the host country. You start to see local participation in self-help and in host country politics more with the second generation, after there's a feeling that they're insufficiently welcome, or I don't want to use the word integrated. I know it's a bad word. Or to put it differently, just as there are proactive and reactive cities, there are also proactive and reactive migrants. And in fact, some migrant groups are perfectly happy to just be left alone by a meddling state. Yeah. Question number 3, how diverse are the local migrants, and do they mix together among themselves spatially so they interact in daily life? Or are they spatially segregated by nationality or class or generation or immigrant status? You know, in a super diverse city, the governance problems are quite different than they are in a city where the migrant group is homogeneous. For example, New York City's website is translated into 11 languages, but you can even get a translation into more than 100 of them. Well, that takes a lot of resources and effort, you know, to engage people in governance, right? Even the ballots are multilingual. So, whereas in the West, or even in Chicago, which is the case study in your book, Spanish is the dominant second language. The majority of migrants are from Mexico or Latin America. So this matters, because when you have pan-ethnicity based on common language, it's a mobilizing resource, but it's also a way to simplify service delivery. So both things go on. So I think it's important to consider the diversity. And number 4, the class composition of the migrants. I mean, when you have middle-class, well-educated leadership, this makes representation of a group in powerful local bodies more likely. Even if they're token representatives, migrants who know how to talk about their problems, and through leaders, they'll feel that they have a voice. So this is important, because a lot of the literature on migrants in the city assume their urban experience is only one of hardship, and the hardship leads them to resistance. But there are more advantaged, skilled migrants who may or may not be politically active. They may not be active because they want to integrate or be upwardly mobile, but having them in the group is a resource. And we're seeing this now with various waves of migrants. Some migrants will, like South Asian migrants, have a relatively large middle class, for example, so that, I don't know, Vivek Ramaswamy can run for president, for example, in America. I just mentioned, so there are these proactive and reactive cities, there are proactive and reactive migrants, and there's this spectrum between them. But the same city can be both pro-skilled migration and anti-asylum or illegal migration. And this was the case in the Gomberg-Muniz chapter. And they faulted the mayor because he uses a welcoming pro-immigrant discourse, and yet the sanctuary cities law had a loophole for criminals. and people who were listed in a gang database. And the people who were in that gang database, it was highly racialized. And that was partly because the city's police criminalized migrants who they stopped and gave out arrest warrants for various reasons. And migrants didn't even know they were on this list. So the focus of the chapter is more about how the migrants push back against this gang database. But the broader context of this is the multi-level, sorry to use that, dispute over sanctuary cities, particularly in the Trump years, even though it started under Obama. I mean, cities are trying to defend themselves against federal or state criminalization of migrants. So in America, there's several things to say. One, and this is why I'm talking about, I'm focusing on the North American cases. But, in the United States, cities are creatures of states. They have home rule charters that can be altered and amended at any time. It takes powers away from the cities. So it's very difficult for cities to pursue a policy when it's at odds with that of the state or the federal government. So for example, there's a very famous case of the governor of Texas who threatened to put the mayor of Austin, Texas in jail because of the sanctuary city rules. And the case that Chicago was talking about was Trump was trying to withhold funds for the police if they didn't cooperate with immigration services. So this was not just true in Chicago. It wasn't just true in Philadelphia. It became a whole dispute with California. It was very, very heated. A number of lawsuits were introduced to talk about the constitutional structure of the federalism in the American government. And they argued, that this attempt by the Trump federal government to to force cities to cooperate with immigration authorities was unconstitutional. There were rulings that it violated 2 amendments of the Constitution. For example, that the Constitution gives spending powers to Congress and not to the president. So Trump could not withhold funds to local police departments, right? So you find a lot of the multi-level governance issues being played out in the courts. Yeah. Eventually in 2021, the Supreme Court refused to take these cases and Biden eliminated the executive order that Trump had put in. So it was resolved. These papers were written in 2021, so it's not clear that they knew about what would happen. The main point is that there's an interplay when you have different political positions on migration at different levels of the government, you get different kinds of policy disputes. So here, right now, the biggest dispute is in New York, because Texas has been busing migrants to Chicago too, but to New York in particular. And the mayor is like going crazy because what's happened is all the migrants are ending up in the homeless shelters. So there's been this huge explosion of homelessness in New York, and the shelters are full and the hotels are full and they don't have the money. And so the mayor is calling on the federal government to help New York out, because they have a rule that they have to, the New York state constitution says that everyone has a right to shelter. And so the city is forced by law to house anybody who presents themselves as homeless. So they're in a state between trying to be liberal and welcoming, if you will, welcoming. I mean, that anyone who's homeless should have a human right to housing. And they don't have the resources to take care of it. So, all right, so that's an example. So now they're overwhelmed, and New York seems to be unfriendly to migrants, but really it's not trying to be. So there is this kind of back and forth on what is a pro-migrant and what is an a reactive city in these cases. I want to bring this up about scale and level issue here also, because it's not really addressed in the book, and that's it. talking about how asylum is a human right and it's guaranteed internationally. So your comparison has been set up of EU versus US, but there's this transnational level of immigration diplomacy that takes place. And what we're seeing is that EU and US is not, their migration policy go well beyond the borders of the global north. So we're seeing externalization of immigration policy where migrants are being basically, well, they're being, there are deals between governments to keep migrants in a third country, right? So, you know,
Even
Europe made a
deported.
deal. Pardon?
Even deported to some other countries.
And deported to these countries, exactly. So there's Turkey, the UK just made a deal with Rwanda of all places, and the United States has this remain in Mexico policy. And so what we're seeing is, you know, efforts to use international diplomacy to solve problems of migration. There was just a big summit between Latin American countries and the United States trying to resolve together a number of policies, not just related to the flows of migration, but, you know, other kinds of multilateral issues that they, for example, cracking down on smugglers, which is also a problem for Frontex in Europe. Yeah. So you have, I mean, so there's this whole additional level that isn't kind of discussed, but it has implications for cities in various ways. So that's something I would encourage you to think about. Now, on Walter Nichols' paper, I just wanted to say a couple more things about that and one comment on the Atlantic paper, and I'll finish. So on this case of Walter Nichols in Los Angeles, they have this argument about he draws upon path dependency literature. And this is part of an institutional turn in urban studies that I'm seeing almost everywhere. And the path dependency literature has a problem with this explanation of social change, because path dependency says things should go on. So the only thing that gets things to change is a crisis, or what they call in that literature critical junctures. Yeah. But one of the things about critical junctures is that very often the change, the crisis, then after it's over, reverts to the path. And that's sort of not addressed, these aspects of path dependency theory in the paper. The other thing that he talks about is scale shift, which is an interesting idea. Like, at what point do organizations move from the local level, which is what this is about, to a national immigration network? And what you see in this scale shift is not brought out explicitly, but as it moves up the ladder, if you will, in terms of scope or scale, if you will, the aims or the objectives of the organization change also. So you see this moving from a community building, service provision, awareness raising, local organization to a more structured and professionalized lobbying organization, which means that they change their staff as well. So there's a goal displacement that takes place when you have a scale shift. Another thing to think about. Okay, final thing. Well, and you know, like, I would just say, something to think about is, why is it important for migrants to hold demonstrations in a place? You know, why does it matter that it's local or that it's urban? It's because it's concentrated in a place. I mean, all over the country now, we're seeing these encampments. Like, why do they need an encampment? They can go out in the street and then go home. Like, why do they have to stay there? There's something about the permanency of space that speaks to politics. It's something to think about. Okay, on the Atlantic paper, and this is my last point, they introduced this very interesting idea of aspiring gateway cities. And this raises a question for me, because a lot of the time we're seeing that migrants are being allocated to particular places by higher levels of government. Sometimes the cities resist. Like in Germany, for example, there's a rule that, that there has to be sort of an equal responsibility for migrants and asylum seekers, and they send them out to different lender. Well, the same thing is true of America. There's the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and say, oh, let's send Somalis to Maine. I mean, Maine, it's the whitest country in the whitest state in the country, and they send Somalis there, right? So the question is, like, why are they there? So high levels of government influence the flows and composition of where the migrants end up. And what's kind of, they could then, in Canada, they let the employers figure out who to recruit and take care of them rather than the local governments. But the point here is, what's the allocation rule here? Like, which places get migrants and which don't? So one of the things that I did a conference years ago with Nina Glick-Schiller, was one of the people when she was working in New Hampshire. So it's kind of interesting to think about it. Is that, the federal government in the United States says, or it's also true in the German government, it's even true in the Berlin Land government, where is their housing? And they send people to where there's vacant housing, because that's the #1 problem. Otherwise, you have to build these container cities, or you have to put people in hotels. So they're always looking for, where is there vacant housing? So the vacant housing is precisely in the depopulated parts of the country. So the Vietnamese ended up in Minnesota. I mean, they're all, if you start to think about why are they being sent to these places? So the same is true. Like, you think about the Atlantic provinces that in Canada, because of depopulation, there's available resources, particularly about housing, if they can get their act together. And indeed, that's what they do in this story. They create a transversal, multi-agency coalition or collaborative, so that not just employers, worrying about employers and giving people jobs, but that the whole community steps in to provide all the other stuff that's needed, because the government, the federal government isn't doing that much for the provinces in that way. Okay, so that's my final point. Thanks a lot. Very provocative chapters, and I look forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Hilary.
Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe before giving the floor to you to respond, and to the participants who are still online to ask eventually questions or make comments, I may add my very short comment, because it goes very much in line with Hilary's and Tiziana's interventions, in the sense that I understand that multi-level governance has a more institutional perspective in a way, looking into jurisdictions and how these jurisdictions interact with one another. I would say here that there are necessary but maybe not sufficient conditions to analyze migration flows and tensions. And by joining what just Hilary said, I think it's very interesting to look at the interscalar tensions, because these jurisdictions, in a way, produce some boundaries which migrants cross just for being somewhere, coming from somewhere and moving to somewhere, according to some sorting mechanisms which Felicitas was also mentioning while she was presenting the book. So from that point of view, the local is the entry point indeed, but it's the entry point to understand how all other levels conflate locally and produce some specific dynamic by providing specific rights or providing specific duties or asking the people to go somewhere, etc., etc. But it's not just institutions, it's also people who have desires and experience this dynamic. It's also labor markets where these people might come and work. It might be the whole welfare system, which might work in different ways in different countries with national rights or localized rights. So from that point of view, it's really a bit of a mix of everything. And the challenge is to disentangle this complexity in a way. And from that point of view, I think the book provides some interesting insights of these tensions, which need to be addressed, probably with similar analytical tools, but understanding the differences from the US and Europe. And also within the US and within Europe, there might be differences as well, because I would imagine that in France or Italy or even Germany or Austria and, I don't know, Denmark and Sweden, the differences are substantial in accessing rights, in getting permits, in permits to work, etc. So this civic stratification, a la Lydia Morris, I think it's an important perspective which complements both the institutional perspective. I'm a rather institutionalist in my analyzing stuff, but I also crash against the limits of institutional perspective. So I see this tension between the institutions and the real world as very fruitful from an analytic point of view, because we need to understand what's going on the ground. And both aspects need to be considered. So I stop here. That was just, let's say, a broader comment rather than a question.
Thank you. May I just jump in on that, Yuri? And thank you, Hilary, for your excellent comment. I really enjoyed it. I took many notes. One point we highlighted in our introduction is the dimension of soft power and, in a way, of ethics, which come in, and we can't measure them, we can't see them, but they're utterly important because it's the only argument for many people we have which are there illegally. We have only humanitarian rights as an approach to do something for those people. So this whole ethic discussion, you can't see, you can't touch, is absolutely important. Also, when it comes to the jumping scales we were speaking about, this is Swingado. You spoke of a scale shift, but we could also say jumping scales to play with the different hierarchies here, right? This would be my point. We must see the soft power, supranational influences like SDGs, but also the Geneva Refugee Convention, for example. You mentioned that, Hilary. That would be a point I want to strengthen here. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Just a few words, if I can. Hilary, thank you very much for those rich empirical comments. I'm actually writing a paper on New York City's asylum crisis. So I'm very aware of the dynamics going on in New York City. And yeah, I mean, I liked all of your comments, and it pushes us in different directions and challenges us to take on the different ways in which, and I think Yuri, you spoke about this as well, the differences within Europe and within North America related to the relationships between different levels or territories and cities and the specifics of cities, the different who are the migrants, the class dynamics or racial dynamics or ethnic dynamics of refugees versus migrants. I think these distinctions are incredibly important. I'm glad you raised that, Hilary, in terms of social movements, who's ready to get on the barricades and who isn't. And, you know, I think you're absolutely right that, I mean, the research shows that many undocumented migrants and asylum seekers are very shy in terms of protest. They don't want to be visible. But in many cases, both in European countries and the US, they also are very, very willing to be visible in protest en masse. And the number of migrants in particular cities may be very important, you know, that kind of critical mass perspective. I could go on commenting on all the rich comments you made, but I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Michael.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are questions or comments from the audience. Now it's the moment you can make them, if you want.
So we are here for you.
Exactly. So take this incredible opportunity to have excellent scholars from worldwide. So one issue, Michael, you just addressed while we are waiting for someone to raise his or her hand, is about how different nationalities might be addressed differently. And we realized that substantially in Europe with Ukraine, with the Ukraine migrants, they got a very privileged fast track for a lot of rights and inclusion, while Afghani and Syrians had to wait for years and were treated very badly. And so also within the NGOs dealing with migration, there was a bit of a discontent somehow that there was this social stratification, politically driven social stratification of migrants according to the country of origin.
But careful here, because you mean the temporary protection directive of the Massenzustromsrichtlinie, right? Hilary?
Yes, also,
And
but
that is only on time. It's for 1 year, so it's still a very precarious situation.
They've extended it.
no, they extended it, and even through
For 1 year, yeah. But it's no perspective in that sense.
Well, but they got a lot of
They got social transfer
additional options. They got very fast track access to healthcare, to benefits, to labor market permits, etc., while others are stuck in a limbo for years.
Yeah.
And so also within these communities, there is a complex set of relations and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the temporality of these policies matters for mobilization. I mean, the same in the United States, you have temporary protected status for Haitians, then it disappears. How does that shape their political mobilization over time? So I think these temporalities are very important as well.
Are crucial, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if
No
there is
questions.
no questions and no comments, I think we can thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you soon somewhere at some point. Not in Lisbon for IMISCO, but maybe, I don't know, LC21 Hilary at least. I don't know.
Santiago.
You're coming
Santiago.
to Santiago, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I decided not to do such ecological disasters any longer. So
A long way.
Closer for me.
For you, it's much
for you,
closer.
it's better. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but it would be nice to meet up, of course. Yeah.
We will see. Maybe we can organize something in Vienna or online
That
again.
would be great.
Might be options. So thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of the day, and thanks for sharing your thoughts on all of that. And have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Hilary.
Same
Take
to
care,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Touch.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.